Preston once said, "The two greatest enemies of the people are criminals and government." So let us tie the second up with the chains of the Constitution so that the second will not become a legalized version of the first. America has strayed far away from her founding values, and because of this, we have strayed away from what the founders and framers originally intended to create through the founding of America. To better explore this statement, we will examine what the founders and framers originally intended to create when they built America. Then we'll discuss the detours and pitfalls that we have encountered along the way. And finally, we will look at specific ways that what we can do to help bring America back on the track that the founders intended. So let's start off at the founding of America in the American Revolution. The colonies resisted the British authority because of the question, who has the right to rule us? A king who lives across the ocean who, up till now, had largely ignored the governing duties in the colonies? Or do the colonists themselves have the right to rule? Wilfred M. McClay, in his book A Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story, recorded a dialogue between Captain Levi Preston, a soldier who fought the Battle of Concord, and Mellon Chamberlain. After Chamberlain asked Preston why he would go to fight the British, Preston replied, "Young man, what we meant in going after these redcoats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean that we should." This was the crux of the American Revolution. Does a king have the right to rule a free people? From this idea of self-governance, the founders and framers designed a government that was both representational and constitutional. They knew the dangers of a tyrannical government, as they just escaped one under King George III. However, they had also learned through the failed Articles of Confederation that if everything is voluntary, well, then nothing really happens. They battled the two extremes and came up with a compromise that was the first of its kind, the American experiment. Under this government, there is unity among independent states, and thus given the name the United States of America. When the framers designed the Constitution, they made one key decision. They made us a republic. And because we are a republic, the law or the Constitution is the highest authority, and not the will of a monarch or of a majority. No authority has the right to override this law. And since the Constitution is the law of the land, it must be respected. And to ensure that this happens, the founders and framers designed a government with three branches holding equal power. These branches provide a checks and balance system. Neither branch has absolute power, and two branches can override one branch should it do something in violation of the Constitution. The founders and framers designed a government that supported individual liberty and a society of self-accountability. However, over the course of the last century, certain policies have been enacted that chip away at the founders and framers' original intent for our country. It started under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs during the Great Depression. History.com says that the New Deal was a set of government welfare and assistance programs designed to help families through and it ended up expanding the scope of the government's influence into the economy. However, these programs did sound like a good idea. They were going to help families through the Great Depression. The only problem with this was they didn't work. In his essay examining why the New Deal failed, Link Daniels said that the New Deal didn't work because it attempted to solve a misdiagnosed root problem. Thus, when they shifted the economy from the private sector and into the public, it prolonged the Great Depression instead of easing it. And this idea of expanding the scope of the government's influence didn't end when the Great Depression did. It manifested itself in multiple presidents and administrations. And today, we can see that these ideas are still in full force. According to Fortunely.com, an estimated 59 million Americans receive welfare in any average month. They went on to say that that is about 19% of the U.S. population. The American government was never supposed to be providing for the American people, merely protecting them and uniting the state governments. And a quote often attributed to Alexis de Tocqueville clearly demonstrates how this is dangerous to the American Republic. He said, "The American Republic will endure until the day that Congress realizes that it can bribe the public with the public's money." The second way that we have strayed away from what the founders originally intended is in the hidden fourth arm of the government in the media. The media has a large influence over our culture today. If they don't report on a story, it's sort of like it never happened. And this kind of control is dangerous to begin with. But in the wrong hands, it can be catastrophic. The media has started to put their own twist or influence when they report on events. For example, example, the June protests of 2020. Depending on where these protests were at, some of them were completely peaceful, and some weren't. The protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin, most certainly were not. The Hill released an article examining CNN's reportings of what went on in that protest. There had been a video that surfaced of a CNN reporter standing in front of a building that was completely inflamed, while he said that the protests were fiery, but mostly peaceful. Axios reported that those protests caused $2 billion worth of damages across the country. Yet the mainstream media would only report them as mostly peaceful, regardless of what was shown to be going on in the background. The media was allowed to have this kind of influence under the First Amendment. However, irresponsible reporting has become an important battle facing the American population today. But we don't need to limit ourselves to what the mainstream media reports on. We can follow in the footsteps of the founders and take personal responsibility for educating ourselves on important issues. The third way that we have strayed away from what the founders originally intended is in the so-called cancel culture. Cancel culture is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as a process of engaging in mass canceling as a means of expressing disapproval or exerting social pressure. Basically, if you do or say something that others deem to be offensive or politically incorrect, social pressure can ensue to get an apology or statement of regret. And oftentimes, regardless of an apology, that individual loses their career, reputation, and social standing, sometimes over a matter of opinion. The Washington Times released an article of people who had been canceled. First on their list was J.K. Rowling, the famous author of the Harry Potter series, has faced backlash after voicing her fears that the push for transgender rights may ultimately endanger women's rights. She has since defended her comments on her website and joined a group of 150 other authors and academics denouncing cancel culture. This has only further infuriated her critics, who called for a boycott of her books and for her publisher to stop paying royalties. Simply questioning the potential side effects of the cancel culture warrants its backlash. And funnily enough, even if you are dead, you can still be canceled. From the same Washington Times article, Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson, the former U.S. presidents' names have been wiped from San Francisco public schools after the school board decided to erase ties to racism and dishonorable legacies. Evidently now, our founding fathers' legacies are dishonorable. And President Lincoln, the president who abolished slavery, has ties to racism. America's founding is rooted in allowing different opinions. The mindset of the cancel culture supports that of mob rule. When our freedom of speech or choice is under attack, either by the government or by social pressure, it warrants a change to the system. We have seen how the founders and framers originally intended to create a government that supported individual liberty, protected the country, and united the states' governments. However, we have strayed away from that intent by encouraging government dependency, by not holding the media accountable for what they report on, and by moving our country away from personal responsibility and towards mob rule. As Americans, we have a duty to protect the American way of life for future generations. We have a duty to elect leaders who will uphold our Constitution and our freedoms. I will be able to vote in this next election. When that election comes around, I challenge you to join me in researching the candidates to figure out what they support and promote. That way, we'll be able to give an educated vote when it's our turn in the ballot box. And as for the media, well, they only have the power and control that we give them. We take their power away by not reading from news sources that don't report factually, by thoroughly investigating important stories, and by reading from multiple news outlets and mediums to get a full picture of the situation at hand. As stated earlier, America is a land built on self-government. We are each responsible for our own actions. The best way to counteract the culture of shame today is to be mindful of what the founders intended. We need to bring responsibility and respect back to the forefront of our society. Respect for our country and the way she was designed, and the responsibility to uphold what is ethically correct and the heritage of the land